I'd like to move on from that comment rapidly, introduce our second speaker, Kathy Kling, who is from, and I have to read this with care, Iowa State University, where she serves as the division head of CARD's Resource and Environmental Policy Division. And her main research line, it relates to agricultural practices and their interactions with water quality and ecosystems more widely.
Wow. Excellent. Thank you very much. Jerry and I, actually, this is a perfect tag team. We only decided we would do quantity and quality, but a lot of what he talked about will help me in what I'm talking about as well, sort of speed through things. I do want to say thank you very much for having me. I will admit that 3 months ago when I was first contacted, I had never heard of the Roundtable on Environmental Health and sort of said, what is this funny thing and what does it have to do with me? Having been here, I've learned a ton already and I'm really pleased to participate, so thanks very, very much. I changed my title a tiny little bit. I was given the title Water Quality, Corn versus Switchgrass. But I'm an economist. I need to just fess up and admit that I'm an economist, and my expertise is in economics. So I'm going to talk a lot about things that I know because I've studied and worked on them, but they're not my primary area. And then I'm going to link some of that to some economics, including some of the kinds of questions that Al was asking about land use and possible competition for land in more than one use of biofuels. So do I have to point this? No. Okay. I'm going to talk about water quality problems. So my first, about a third of my talk is just to try to give you a very quick 5,000 to 10,000 foot overview of water quality problems associated with large agricultural land use. And I don't mean large farms or small farms. I mean land that has intensively used by agriculture, which the entire part of the Midwest is. And some of Jerry's slides kind of gave you that picture. I'm going to talk about the problem of hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico. Again, this is just going to be a broad overview. I'm then going to turn to corn, which is one of the favorite subjects of Iowans, apparently. I'm going to talk about how corn contributes to the problem, a little bit more detail about the way it grows and what the issues are. And then I'm going to turn to the potential for switchgrass and why it is often looked to as a possible solution to some of these problems. Okay, water quality. The top picture is a picture of a healthy lake system. It was taken by a colleague of mine at Iowa State, and it's the littoral zone of freshwater lakes. I learned that from him. It's clear, relatively clear water, and there's lots of diversity of things growing in it, is kind of what you're meant to take from that. The picture underneath it is a very bad piece of water quality. It's a cyanobacteria bloom, which comes from a toxic algae. This is a problem that is in the Midwest. It's in the East Coast and the Chesapeake Bay. It's in the western part of the United States. And it's largely driven by humans generating too much nutrients. Nitrogen and phosphorus are the nutrients that we're talking about. Lots of them come from municipal sources, like in the Chesapeake Bay area. You get lots of this phosphorus and nitrogen coming from urban sources. In the Midwest, and what I'm going to largely be talking about, it comes off ag fields, farm fields. And it comes from fertilizer, it comes from manure, and it drains off into local waters and streams where it does what fertilizer does. It makes stuff grow. That's good in small quantities if it's growing what you want it to grow. If it's being imported into natural areas, it creates heavy growth of algae and other kinds of plants that then take over areas. They grow excessively and they create all sorts of havoc, basically. I put some statistics from EPA on the left just to give you some notion that this is really an extensive problem in the United States. There's a lot of problems with the data, but the picture is still very clear. Many, many lakes and streams and rivers in the U.S. are very low water quality. Here's another picture gunky green stuff. When you drive by a lake or a river and you see gunky green stuff, that's a pretty good sign that the water quality is bad. Here's similar kinds of pictures and data about rivers and streams. Anywhere from a quarter to a half of the rivers and streams in the entire United States suffer from nutrient enrichment or eutrophication. Those are words that all mean more or less the same thing. There's far too much nutrients in them. They're growing algae, and that's creating problems for habitat, and it makes the water smell. There can be fish kills. There can be any number of problems. Now, here I need to pause for a second with respect to this group. The health effects of these problems are not particular. What is known about the health effects of these problems is not particularly large. That is my understanding. What do I mean? We don't drink this water. If the water is bad, it goes through nitrification plants. All of our water from cities is tested. So it isn't a human health risk in that sense. There is some human health risk if you swim or float or get in the water. Colleagues at Iowa State tell me that there would probably be more human health issues if we studied it more and tested the water more and were more careful about controlled studies. But that's not my area, and so I leave that to you. Largely, though, most people consider this an ecosystem health problem. The problem is not getting better. That's the only thing that this is intended to show, and it's just the number of waters that have been assessed that show that they don't meet the uses to which they're supposed to be. So the only take home from that is that things are not improving. That, I hope, gives you a picture of local water quality problems, all the lakes and rivers and streams across much of the United States. There's another very related problem, which is called hypoxia, or the dead zone, or dead zones in general. These, and the one in particular I'm going to be talking a little bit about is the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. These occur from the same sources. Nitrogen and phosphorus, nutrients, move through rivers and streams, and when they hit estuaries, they move, they sit on top of the water. So what you see in this cartoon is an algae bloom, which is being fed by nutrients coming down, in this case, the Mississippi or Atchafalaya rivers into the Gulf. They then create lots of phytoplankton, lots of growth of stuff. It then dies, as it's wont to do. As it dies, it falls through the water column and decomposes and uses up all the oxygen. Dead zone is actually a very accurate term. The oxygen concentration is too low, 2 parts per million, I think is the number that's used, in large parts of the zone to support any life. Anything that can move, like the big fish, swim away if they can. Small things die, and it obviously has potentially long-term major effects on the ecosystem, but these are not necessarily well documented and well understood. What is pretty well understood is the size of the zone from year to year and the major sources of the problem. We've got a map up here of the U.S., and this time, instead of the states, Jerry had some nice maps that showed states and where things are located within the states. Here what I have is juxtaposed on top of the states is the major watersheds. So if you look down there where it says hypoxic zone, that's the area that is sometimes impacted by less than 2 milligrams parts per million. What is it? 2 milligrams? Dead zones. I'm an economist, can never get numbers right. I'm going to call this the dead zone, yeah. The shaded area, which is the gray and the white, that's the Mississippi River Basin. Any water from that, anything in that entire gray or white, ultimately moves from wherever it starts down through to the Gulf of Mexico. The Mississippi River Basin, as you can see, covers about 2/3 of the U.S., so it's quite large. However, the main sources of nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, that are coming into the Gulf come from the upper Mississippi River Basin, which is that part called Upper Mississippi, and the Ohio-Tennessee, which you can also see. So that part of the basin, which is about 1/3 of the size of the basin, contributes about 70 to 80% of the nutrients. So if you want to target your efforts to solve problems related to the Gulf, you want to be focused on those areas. This is data from Nancy Rabelais, who since 1985 has done an annual survey of the size of the hypoxic zone. So that's the south coast of Louisiana that you're looking at for context and scale. This is kind of a neat picture. Each one of those dots is a transect where she takes her boat in July every summer and does a measurement of the oxygen concentration. She's done that once a year since 1985, except one year she didn't have any money to run her boat, and so there's a missing data point in one year. And then this maps whether the degree of times that that particular transect was hypoxic or not. So the largest hypoxic zone, which would be the entire area, only happened once, therefore was less than 25% of the time. That's that light blue. The darker blue, the 25 to 50%, less than 50% and over 75%. So you can read it. The point here is the hypoxic zone can be huge. It can also be small. It varies by year. It's very much affected by weather in addition to the amount of nutrients that come in. But it is clearly much larger than it would have been without human-induced nutrients flowing into it. And really the only way to address it and make it much smaller is to significantly cut back on the amount of nutrients. Okay, what does that have to do with corn? Here's another corn picture. This is good because it's a little different than the corn pictures Jerry had. And I'm gonna assume that some of you actually don't have a love for corn and don't really know very much about corn. I'm going to take a minute to explain a little bit of language that you may, if you already know, apologies. So this is my colleague Bruce Babcock, who is an ag economist and lives in Ames, and that's why he's got an Iowa State Soccer Club shirt on. He's holding a piece of corn, okay? The yellow stuff on that corn is the corn grain. That's what you make ethanol out of. The vast majority of ethanol that we make now is from the grain. There's a whole bunch more on that plant there, right? It's tall. It's not, that's, by the way, was very healthy corn. You wait till corn is really dry before you harvest it. So it gets really tall, then it dries, and that's really good. It lowers the cost of processing it. So this is a very healthy cornfield. It's just in fall. All of that stalk, that's the cellulose. So when people are talking about making biofuels from cellulosic and using corn, they're talking about the stover, which is that stuff, or the stalk. Okay, that's what they're talking about. Largely, that is not being done now. Largely, the only thing that is being used is the yellow grain. If you cut that corn down, it's a good idea, actually, to leave a bunch of that, what is sometimes called ag waste. Don't say that to a soil scientist, because when you cut that stuff down and put it on the top of the soil, that's how you make new soil, right? That's where all it stores a bunch of carbon and all the other stuff. It breaks down, and that's how the soil itself is being made. So Jerry mentioned the point that if we were to start to make ethanol from a cellulosic part of corn, we would cut a bunch of that down and use a bunch of it, but there would be a trade-off in terms of creating and building our soil and soil erosion problems. Okay, so again, just in case people didn't already know that. Some more information about corn that you may or may not want to know. And now we're getting to water quality and the relationship to corn. This is a corn plant and field that, and what it looks like, well, it's got a tractor on it, but this is what the corn fields look like about half of the year. You drive by through Iowa this time of year, if it's not snow, you're going to see that. If you drive in the summer, you're going to see 6-foot corn. What's the point? It's an annual crop. You plant new seed each year, it grows, it produces this highly valuable product. To do that, however, you have to put a lot of nitrogen on it, lots of manure and nitrogen, purchased fertilizer, and there's runoff to streams and rivers. Even if you do what are called best management practices and you apply it pretty carefully, you're still almost always going to get lots of runoff. It is a leaky crop, and that's because it is an annual. You put this fertilizer on it, and even if you do a really, really good job, you can reduce the amount of fertilizer and nutrients coming off, but you're still going to have a lot coming off, according to my agronomy friends. Phosphorus sediment are also things that come off. They tend to move with the sediment, and so when you get soil erosion, you get phosphorus moving with it. Nitrogen, nitrates move with the water. Okay, I'm sure that was more than you want to know, but now you know it. Here's another picture of the United States and a picture of the watersheds, but this time I've put on top the location where corn is grown. Okay, so all due deference to Jerry and his worries about quantity and irrigated agriculture, most corn is actually grown where we don't irrigate, and that's in Iowa, Illinois, and that corn belt, that's called the corn belt for a reason, okay? Heavy, heavy production of corn in that area. That's good for preserving aquifers to some degree because we don't have such water problems, but it's bad for hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico, okay? All right. Nutrients are an externality, okay? They come off the land, whether it's phosphorus or nitrogen, they end up in the waters and they create problems either in local rivers and streams, or they move all the way down to the Gulf and they create problems in terms of hypoxia and the dead zone. Agriculture and nutrients are essentially unregulated and unpriced. These are non-priced externalities. However, there's lots of different ways to address those externalities. You can do a better job with fertilizer timing and the amount you put on. You can plant cover crops so that it's not bare for 6 months, so that you have 6 months of an annual and then cover crops for another 6 months. You can change how you till. You can do things like put wetlands carefully and strategically in a watershed that will capture the nutrients coming off and process them before it moves down to rivers and streams. There are bioreactors, there are tile drains. There's a number of different things that can be done, but they aren't. Why aren't they done? Because it's costly, and there's no reason for an individual producer to do it. The externality is not priced, there's no regulations, there's no requirements, and hence we have a sort of very predictable situation where too much nutrients are coming off this land. Again, experts suggest that to get the 40 to 50% reduction in nutrients that have been talked about to achieve reductions in the hypoxic zone, we would need not just 1 or 2 of those things done, we would need an enormous amount of them done. We'd need a major change in what that landscape looks like. Okay, enter switchgrass. There's a nice picture of switchgrass on the left and a cartoon version of it on the right. On the left, I need a person there to show you height, and I don't have one. Switchgrass is also a very tall plant. What is most notable about it for environmental purposes is that it is not an annual. It is a perennial. You plant it, it has very deep roots, and that's what the little cartoon shows you, that stay in place for a long time, year after year. You cut the top and take that to your ethanol plant and convert it, if there were any ethanol plants that could convert switchgrass at a reasonable cost, which there aren't any. that Jerry made that point. So we're in right now in a little bit in more than a little bit in what if land here. We simply don't have the technology. But part of the reason that people are very excited about trying to develop that technology has to do with the fact that this is a perennial. It has nowhere near the problems of erosion, and it may have good characteristics with respect to nitrogen and nutrients. And I'll say one more thing about that in just a minute. In this dream world, this what-if world, is where academics like me live. So we've done several studies where we have taken watershed-based water quality models and calibrated them, fit them to a whole bunch of existing data, and then done what-if scenarios. What if switchgrass were to be viable and competitive? What if we were to put it extensively on the landscape? What would that mean for water quality? How much less nutrients would go into our waters? And we've done some cost sorts of things as well. What I'm going to do is just a couple slides to give you an overview of the kinds of things we have found. You now see a map of Iowa and a sub-watershed called the Raccoon River watershed. It is the watershed from which the water flows to Des Moines, which is drinking water. So in theory, we should care about nitrate concentrations for drinking water. In reality, we don't, because there's a large denitrification plant that has been built, which runs 100 days a year or something. So whenever the nitrate levels get too high, they run the plant, and there's no drinking water health problems for people that drink from that, which is most of us. Okay, so that's just to give you the location of it. Some quick numbers to give you a flavor of what this hypothetical scenario suggests. The baseline scenario you see there is the existing corn, soybean usage of that landscape. One thing to note in that baseline, 76% of the land area, and this would have been about 2004, I think, in that entire watershed is a corn-soybean rotation. Corn one year, soybean the next year. A little bit of grassland, a little bit of forest, and about 1% is left for a few people and animals. This is corn-soybean country. This is a heavy corn. This is what you see when you drive across Iowa or Nebraska. In our scenarios, we first said, well, what happens if we expand corn acreage and corn intensity to water quality? So the first scenario we did was take cropland that was currently in the Conservation Reserve Program. That's cropland that we have paid farmers to take out of production. It's about 2% of the land. And we put that into corn. Not surprisingly, we see an increase in nitrogen coming off the landscape, predicted by our models, an increase in phosphorus and sediment. If we convert all the pasture and grassland, which is about 18% of the land, we get a huge increase in, well, we get a 33% increase in nitrogen, about the same in phosphorus and sediment. Finally, if we convert the whole thing into just complete corn, continuous corn, which is not having that soybean rotate in corn, 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 we get a significant increase in the amount of nitrogen. When we were doing this, this was 5-6 years ago, we could see that ethanol was expanding. And so while these scenarios seemed a little outrageous, we wanted to do this what if because we could see that we might be heading that direction. And indeed, we are a lot closer to 2 and 3 than we were back in the baseline. Okay, complete hypothetical. What if we were to put switchgrass on the land? And here, 25%, 50%, and 100% are the amounts of land that we put we just arbitrarily in this what-if scenario put switchgrass on. Here, we get a small improvement in nitrogen, a huge improvement in the amount of phosphorus and sediment coming off. Our model predicts a relatively small improvement, so negatives are good here. Our model predicts a relatively small reduction in nitrogen relative to some of the other studies that have been done, and I think the main difference is the amount of fertilization you assume would be done if switchgrass is being grown for commercial purposes. If you put prairie grasses out there and don't treat them as a commercial product, of course you wouldn't fertilize, you wouldn't spend any money on them. But if you fertilize them to the amount that is going to be the most efficient from commercial profit making, then you're still going to put nitrogen fertilizer on, and you're still going to get some runoff. Okay, so that's the source of the difference. I won't argue that it's exactly right. Okay, I'm running out of time, or have run out, so I'm going to skip a couple things. We also did some work. I'm not going to tell you the details of this, except to tell you what it is, which is we looked at the possibilities of switchgrass as a way to reduce flood risk. Switchgrass is really good at holding water on the land. That's this perennial aspect of it. So this is a distribution of flood risk under current corn soybean versus what the flood risk scenarios would look like in a Monte Carlo type study. And essentially what we found is that you reduce the risk of flooding, you shift the distribution far to the left. And I would talk you through it a little bit if we had time, but that's the gist of it, is that we found some really significant improvements in things like flood risk reduction. Okay. So I was going to talk about, is switchgrass the answer? And first I was going to say, well, wait a minute, it depends on what the question is. If the question is, how do we best use our land to produce the most valuable mix of food and fuel and environmental services, then we want to think broadly about water quality, greenhouse gases, the value of food, the value of energy, and everything else when we think about that problem, and not get focused just on greenhouse gases or just on hypoxia or any particular thing. And in that case, the answer is maybe. So I think, can I have one more minute?
If you promise it's 60 seconds minute.
All right, yeah. It's a 60-second minute. So I'll jump to I'll skip this. Here we go. I was going to talk marginal land. In terms of thinking about what we want to grow, where we want to grow it, and what we want to use it for, the bottom line is we always are going to face trade-offs. There's no free lunches in let's grow switchgrass and only put it on something we call marginal land, or let's try to do something we're always faced with trade-offs because we only have a fixed amount of land, and we have to decide what's the most productive and valuable way of using that land, and we need to account for all of the externalities that are out there. Switchgrass has some good features. Corn has some good features. We're probably going to end up wanting a mixture of the two if we can ever get second-generation biofuels to be productive. So my take-home points I'll put up here and leave because I've already talked about them.
Okay, thank you. Stay there.